Have you ever wondered if a king's greatest weakness could be hidden in the very same place as his greatest power? History often tells us about crowns, swords, wars, and victories, but sometimes the real secret lies behind closed doors. In the quiet of a room where no soldiers stand guard, no courtiers whisper flattery, and only a strange stillness lingers. Maybe you're hearing these words late at night, when the world outside is hushed, and the faint glow of a lamp flickers softly in the corner. Or perhaps you're lying in a darkened room, a light blanket resting over you, your eyes growing heavier with each passing moment. If so, you're safe here, and this story will take you far away to another time, to a royal palace where marble walls hid secrets deeper than politics and velvet curtains concealed the most unsettling truth of a reign. If you enjoy wandering into the quiet corners of forgotten history, consider subscribing to our channel so that next time we can take another slow walk together into the past. And let me know in the comments, where are you listening from? London? Lahore? New York? Or maybe from a shadowed little room where every sound seems to echo just slightly. Tonight, we step into the year 1834 inside the royal palace of Madrid, where the King of Spain, Ferdinand VII, has just passed away. Yet for his royal physician, the work is far from over. The palace is draped in muted candlelight, the air heavy with the mixed scents of wax and incense. Footsteps echo softly along the corridors as the Queen Regent, Maria Cristina, stands in the doorway. Her eyes are wet, her expression controlled, and her words carry an order that is as strange as it is chilling. On the royal bed, beneath layers of silk, lies the body of a man who once ruled with a mix of fear, vanity, and stubborn pride. But it is not his face that draws your attention. It is something else, hidden just beneath those sheets. A part of him so unusual, so infamous. In whispers that no historian dared to put it plainly into official accounts. It was, for Ferdinand, both a source of shame and a twisted kind of pride. As the physician's hands, now gloved, begin the slow, careful preparation for preservation, his mind drifts through the palace's long corridors of memory to murmured stories of specially made cushions, wives' startled cries in the night, and desperate, almost ritualistic attempts to create an heir, despite nature's cruel design. What he is preserving is not just flesh and bone, but the physical symbol of a reign that was itself misshapen, overgrown, and ultimately destructive to everything it touched. Ferdinand's story begins long before this silent chamber, with his birth into one of the most entangled bloodlines in Europe. For centuries, the Habsburgs and Bourbons of Spain had married within their own family, weaving a genetic net so tight that every child was the result of cousins marrying cousins, uncles to nieces, generation after generation. The result was a slow accumulation of inherited troubles, from fragile minds to twisted bodies. Ferdinand, born on October 14, 1784, at El Escorial Palace, was the son of King Charles IV and Queen Maria Louisa, themselves first cousins. The dice had been thrown long before he took his first breath, and the cruelest outcome of this genetic gamble fell upon the most private part of his body. As he grew from boyhood to youth, it became clear that something about him was unlike other men, a development that baffled court physicians, disturbed family members, and fascinated the cruel gossip of the royal household. His anatomy, impossible to ignore once known, was both too large and too strangely shaped to be considered normal. Even without seeing it, people in the palace knew, servants whispering in corners, diplomats sending careful reports back to their courts. And Ferdinand, even as a young man, could sense the glances, the hidden laughter, the silence that fell whenever he entered a room. That silence began to harden him, turning embarrassment into suspicion, suspicion into resentment. By the time his reign began, that private burden had already shaped his public self. And here, In this dimly lit chamber in 1834, with the king's body lying still, the physician cannot help but wonder how much of Spain's history had been quietly bent out of shape by what was hidden under those sheets. The real story is only beginning, and the next chapter will show how this strange royal inheritance would go on to twist the fate of a kingdom. From the moment Ferdinand emerged into the public eye as the heir to the Spanish throne, the whispers followed him like an invisible shadow, curling through the marble corridors and velvet-draped antechambers of every palace he entered. They were not the usual court rumors of political intrigue or romantic scandals, though those too would come in abundance, but whispers about something far more private and unsettling, his physical form. By his teenage years, the palace physicians had already taken to making cryptic notes in carefully locked ledgers, describing an unusual development in terms that tiptoed between clinical precision and restrained disbelief. They recorded a member whose proportions defied the standard anatomy of man, narrow at the base like the stem of a quill, swelling to a thickness nearer a clenched fist toward the tip, and extending to a length that, if placed upright on a desk, could almost serve as a walking stick. This was not the kind of detail that could be put in official court records, so it passed instead from physician to physician in guarded conversations, sealed letters, and coded phrases in medical archives. Ferdinand himself was keenly aware of the difference. In an era when the ideal male form was still judged by the proportions of Greek statuary, small, symmetrical, and modestly balanced, his body was seen not as a gift, but as a freakish deviation from nature's order. His earliest years were lived in the shadow of two deeply flawed parents. His father, Charles IV, was by all accounts more devoted to hunting than to governing, a man who treated kingship as an inherited inconvenience. His mother, Queen Maria Louisa, was as notorious for her appetite for influence and pleasure as she was for her open liaison with Manuel de Godoy, the real power behind the Spanish crown in those years. For young Ferdinand, life in the royal household meant watching his father retreat into distraction, while his mother's private indiscretions became the talk of Europe. If the affairs and political humiliations were not enough to shape the boy's temperament, the whispers about his body ensured. He grew up with an ingrained sense of humiliation. Servants chuckled behind their hands, courtiers exchanged knowing glances, and foreign ambassadors reported in veiled terms to their governments about the peculiar inheritance of Spain's future king. In such an atmosphere, Ferdinand learned early that intimacy was dangerous, trust was foolish, and mockery could come from anyone, whether a political enemy or a supposed ally. These lessons hardened into habits. As he moved into adolescence, his demeanor began to change in ways that unsettled even his tutors. The young prince grew secretive, suspicious, and vindictive toward those around him. Servants who made even minor errors were dismissed without warning. Others, accused of nothing more than being in the wrong place at the wrong time, found themselves exiled from the palace entirely. One incident, recorded in the memoirs of a court chaplain, captured the depth of Ferdinand's paranoia. When a young page accidentally walked in on the prince changing clothes, Ferdinand did not simply scold or dismiss him. He had the boy flogged and the boy's family banished from Madrid, ensuring no trace of the moment could survive. By the time he reached marriageable age, the stakes of his condition had become painfully clear. The task of producing an heir, the primary duty of any royal marriage, would not be simple. Dr. Francisco Flores, the king's physician, left behind notes so frank that they were hidden in the Vatican archives for nearly 2 centuries. He described a configuration of such improbable shape and length that normal relations would risk severe harm to any partner, necessitating the invention of aids and supports to make the act possible. This is where Ferdinand's reign over. His household began to resemble the operations of a secret workshop. Royal craftsmen, sworn to silence, were tasked with creating custom-made devices, padded cushions to control angle and depth, supports to bear weight, and specially designed oils to reduce friction. These marital aids, as they were euphemistically called, were less like the tools of pleasure and more like medical equipment for a dangerous procedure. Alongside the physical challenges came the mental ones. Ferdinand grew obsessed with remedies that promised to normalize his body or improve its function. He paid vast sums to charlatans offering exotic powders and infusions, from ground rhinoceros horn to powdered pearl mixed with saffron, all of which promised to either reduce or enhance him depending on the claimed need. He even invited foreign alchemists to Madrid, their heads full of miracle cures, their hands ready to take generous payment for potions that predictably failed. In 1802, Ferdinand's first marriage was arranged to Princess Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily, his first cousin. She was a romantic young woman, imagining herself wed to the desired one, a nickname promoted by Ferdinand's political allies to suggest a prince both virtuous and vigorous. The wedding day itself was a spectacle of music, jewels, and public adoration, but what followed that night was a disaster so profound it would mark them both forever. Maria Antonia, inexperienced and sheltered, had no preparation for what awaited her in the bridal chamber. When Ferdinand appeared unclothed, her reaction was immediate and panicked. She screamed and backed away, reportedly shouting, "Monster! Monster!" as her ladies rushed in. What followed was less a wedding night and a carefully orchestrated medical operation. Physicians, already in attendance under the guise of royal attendants, arranged the cushions, applied oils, and explained to the terrified bride how the process must proceed. Even with every device and precaution, the act was traumatic. Maria Antonia required laudanum, a powerful opiate, to endure it, beginning an addiction that would deepen with each failed attempt to conceive. Their marriage settled into a grim routine, the king summoning his physicians, the room prepared like a surgical theater, the queen drugged into compliance, the act performed with clinical detachment, and the two separating immediately afterward to recover. Month after month, year after year, there was no pregnancy. Ferdinand became convinced the problem was not his but hers, that her disgust was somehow blocking conception. He escalated to having restraints made of leather and silk to keep her in place, commissioning these from the same artisans who made his saddles. He even consulted astrologers, aligning their attempts with lunar phases, and mystics who claimed ancient Eastern methods would unlock his fertility. Once, astonishingly, Maria Antonia did conceive, twice in fact, but both pregnancies ended in tragedy, one in miscarriage at 4 months, the other nearly at term, but ending in a bloody, harrowing loss that almost killed her. These failures deepened Ferdinand's paranoia. He accused her of sabotage, of secretly taking preventatives, of harboring political views that made her unwilling to bear him a Catholic heir. By 1807, she was a ghost of her former self, physically weakened, addicted to laudanum, and consumed by the belief that she was cursed. Her death that year, officially from fever, was whispered to be the result of poison, perhaps at Ferdinand's order. The palace apothecary died suddenly. Days later, his final letter seized and never revealed. Whether true or not, the rumors became another stone in the wall of fear and secrecy Ferdinand built around himself. His private shame had by now fused entirely with his public persona. Those who met him in court saw the polite mask. Those within his inner circle saw a man whose most intimate failures had hardened into a lifelong need to control, punish, and conceal. And as Spain itself stood on the brink of political turmoil, its future bound to this man's demons, the stage was set for a reign where the bedroom and the throne room would be poisoned by the same restless, suspicious mind. But the most disturbing transformations, both in the man and in the kingdom he ruled, were yet to come, and the shadows around him were only beginning to darken. When Maria Antonia's death removed Ferdinand's first queen from the palace, it did not remove the problem that had haunted him since his youth. If anything, her passing seemed to intensify his obsession with securing an heir and proving, at least to himself, that his condition could be conquered. The court, ever eager to smooth over royal troubles, quickly set about finding him a second wife, one who, it was hoped, might be more resilient, more compliant, and perhaps more willing to endure what the first could not. In 1816, the chosen candidate arrived, Maria Isabel of Portugal, another cousin in the seemingly endless loop of Bourbon and Habsburg intermarriages. She was 19, a young woman with the fresh optimism of someone raised on tales of royal duty and grandeur. In her mind, she was about to become part of the grand tradition of Spanish queens, a partner to the king, a mother to future princes. But the truth awaiting her in the silent halls of Madrid was far stranger and far darker than anything her upbringing had prepared her for. The wedding was staged with all the pageantry expected of the Spanish court. Streets were hung with banners, choirs filled the cathedral with soaring hymns, and the royal couple exchanged vows beneath the glittering canopy of the high altar. To the public, Ferdinand was every inch the triumphant monarch restored to his throne after the Napoleonic Wars. In private, he was a man rehearsing medical instructions for his wedding night. As the sun set on their first day of marriage, Maria Isabel's ladies were approached by members of the king's household, carrying crates and packages whose contents were explained in hushed tones. There were the custom-made cushions, precisely measured to bear the peculiar weight of the king's anatomy, jars of perfumed oils with numbing additives, and other implements whose shapes suggested medical devices more than instruments of romance. Maria Isabel, though more worldly than Ferdinand's first wife, was unprepared for the sight that met her in the bridal chamber. Her first reaction was not a scream, but a stunned, speechless stare, as though confronted with a puzzle that defied solution. Ferdinand, ever sensitive to perceived judgment, interpreted her frozen expression as mockery. What followed was another carefully managed encounter, physicians waiting discreetly outside the chamber doors, and the now familiar arrangement of supports and aids designed to make the act possible without catastrophic injury. Even with these, the experience was harrowing for the young queen. Servants reported hearing muffled cries, the sound of furniture shifting under strain, and later, the quiet sobs of a bride alone in her bed. From that night on, Maria Isabel's demeanor changed. She developed a stutter, flinched when the king entered a room, and avoided eye contact during public events. In private, her ladies described episodes of what physicians at the time called nervous disturbance, what we would now recognize as trauma responses. Yet Ferdinand saw her fear not as the result of his actions, but as evidence of disloyalty. His paranoia, already sharp-edged, began to grow teeth. He suspected that she was mocking him in secret, conspiring with foreign envoys to spread rumors about his condition, perhaps even plotting to deny him an heir on political grounds. To guard against this imagined treachery, he intensified surveillance. Within the palace, Maria Isabel's correspondence was intercepted and read. Her food was tested for poison. Her movements were recorded by trusted guards. The royal marriage, intended as a symbol of stability, became a cage of suspicion. All the while, the pressure to produce an heir mounted. The court physicians, perhaps out of desperation, began inviting foreign specialists to observe and advise on the king's intimate difficulties. Some came from Germany, others from France or Italy, bringing with them anatomical diagrams, mechanical prototypes, and an air of morbid curiosity. It is said that one French physician compared the king's marital arrangements to a siege engine constructed for an impossible fortress. These visits turned the royal bedchamber into a theater of medical voyeurism, with Maria Isabel subjected to examinations and procedures that blurred the line between treatment and spectacle. She began losing weight at an alarming rate, her eyes taking on the hollow look of someone who has stopped believing in escape. The palace was awash in whispered debates about whether the queen could survive long, enough to produce the child the nation expected. Outside the palace walls, Spain itself was unraveling. Colonial revolts in the Americas gained momentum, fueled in part by propaganda portraying Ferdinand as physically unfit to rule, his deformities a metaphor for the deformity of his reign. Pamphlets smuggled in from Buenos Aires and Caracas depicted him as a grotesque caricature, a bloated figure straining beneath the weight of his misshapen form, unable to father heirs just as he was unable to govern effectively. The king's response was not to address the political crises, but to double down on secrecy. He ordered the construction of hidden passageways linking his private apartments to those of the queen, so he could approach her without being seen. Mirrors were placed at strategic angles to catch reflections of anyone who might be eavesdropping. Servants were rotated constantly so that no one would have time to establish alliances or share dangerous information. Maria Isabel's health continued to deteriorate under this regime. She suffered fainting spells, irregular fevers, and what the court physicians termed phantom pregnancies, episodes in which her body mimicked the early signs of conception without actually carrying a child. For Ferdinand, these false hopes were cruel torments. During each episode, he would pace outside her chamber, whispering prayers to saints and muttering imprecations against imagined enemies. When the truth inevitably revealed itself, he would fall into a sulk that could last for weeks, ignoring affairs of state entirely. In 1818, after 2 years of this strange and joyless marriage, Maria Isabel died. The official cause was nervous exhaustion, but palace insiders spoke of something closer to surrender. Her confessor later claimed her final words were a quiet expression of gratitude that her suffering was ending. Ferdinand's reaction was as unsettling as it was telling. Publicly, he played the role of grieving widower, but privately, he launched investigations into her death, convinced she had been murdered to prevent him from producing an heir. He ordered multiple autopsies, had her ladies-in-waiting questioned under threat, and kept a death mask of her face in his private chambers, where he was seen conversing with it on more than one occasion. Yet even in the shadow of her funeral, his search for a new wife began. Spain's political instability and his own growing notoriety made the negotiations difficult. Many European princesses declined outright, unwilling to risk the fate of his first 2 queens. Still, Ferdinand's need for an heir, and for the illusion that his condition could be conquered, would drive him toward a 3rd marriage, one that would take the strange private rituals of the Spanish crown to an even more surreal level. But that part of the story belongs to the next chapter, where the king's obsessions would intertwine with the slow collapse of his kingdom in ways both absurd and tragic. By the time Ferdinand's 2nd queen, Maria Isabel, had been lowered into her marble tomb, the walls of the royal palace in Madrid had absorbed more whispered rumors than any courtier dared count. Twice the young king had married. Twice the hopeful image of a royal family had collapsed under the weight of reality. And twice, the private chambers of the palace had become places of whispered dread rather than wedded bliss. Yet, as ever, the machinery of monarchy demanded the search for a new bride, for the dynastic duty of producing an heir was not a matter of personal choice, but of political survival. By 1819, after months of cautious negotiation and the quiet rejection of more suitable candidates, the court settled on Maria Josepha Amelia of Saxony, a 24-year-old princess whose family's precarious finances made them willing to overlook the increasingly lurid stories surrounding the king. Maria Josepha arrived in Madrid, older and more worldly than Ferdinand's previous wives, with a reputation for piety, discipline, and a sharp mind. She also came with something neither Maria Antonia nor Maria Isabel had possessed: a private physician of her own, an experienced Saxon doctor who had been briefed in carefully coded language about the delicate circumstances of the Spanish royal marriage. From the moment her carriage rolled through the palace gates, Maria Josepha treated her role not as a romantic union, but as a clinical challenge, approaching her marital duties with the methodical mindset of someone tasked with solving an unusually complex and unpleasant puzzle. The wedding itself was modest compared to Ferdinand's earlier unions, a reflection of Spain's mounting financial troubles and the fatigue of a court that had seen too many processions end in tragedy. Still, the king's attire glittered with gold embroidery, and the chapel echoed with solemn music as they exchanged vows before the high altar. Yet behind the serene faces and folded hands, there was an almost palpable sense of weariness in the air, as though everyone present suspected they were watching the opening scene of a familiar and unwelcome play. In the privacy of their first evening together, Maria Josepha was introduced to the array of devices and preparations that had become standard in the Spanish royal bedchamber: the tailored cushions, the lubricating oils, the supports designed to bear the strange proportions of the king's body. But unlike her predecessors, she had come prepared. Her medical advisor had supplied additional implements, including adjustable padded braces and specially treated linens, all packed discreetly among her bridal trousseau. The queen kept meticulous records of each encounter, noting dates, techniques, and results with the precision of a scientist, sometimes even sketching diagrams to be sent under layers of coded language to her physician back in Saxony. For Ferdinand, this cold professionalism was almost worse than fear or disgust. He began to suspect that Maria Josepha saw him not as a husband, but as a medical specimen, her calm detachment a form of unspoken judgment. His paranoia grew once again, this time tinged with a fear that she was documenting his condition for foreign courts, perhaps to humiliate him, perhaps to use as leverage in political negotiations. Spies were instructed to monitor her correspondence, reporting not only the words, but the expressions on her face as she wrote. Still, the mechanical rhythm of their attempts at conception continued, each session planned like a military operation. Each failure met with a tightening of Ferdinand's temper. Beyond the walls of the royal apartments, Spain was in free fall. One by one, the American colonies declared independence, stripping away the wealth that had sustained the Spanish crown for centuries. Cabinet meetings were postponed when Ferdinand's private treatments ran late. Decisions on matters of war and trade were delayed for weeks while he entertained foreign doctors offering new theories for his condition. Revolutionary pamphlets made their way into the capital, mocking the king's inability to father an heir as a symbol of his inability to govern. A throne is as barren as the royal bed, one notorious broadside declared, an insult that Ferdinand kept hidden from the queen, but brooded over for weeks. Then, in 1829, after a decade of this peculiar and joyless marriage, the impossible seemed to happen. Maria Josepha was pregnant. The news swept through the palace like wildfire, lighting a brief and fragile hope that all the years of humiliation might finally yield a living heir. Ferdinand, exultant and terrified, surrounded her with layers of protection, guards at her door, food tasters for every meal, and blessings from priests of every order in Madrid. Yet the pregnancy was fragile from the start, and by the 7th month, complications had set in, likely a placental abruption, though the physicians of the time could only speak of bleeding without cause. Modern medicine might have managed it. Ferdinand's court, however, descended into chaos. The king refused to allow standard treatments without first consulting mystics and alchemists, summoning astrologers to determine the safest days for intervention. The palace became a surreal mix of medical urgency and medieval superstition. On May 18th, Maria Josepha went into premature labor. The delivery was brutal and chaotic, with Ferdinand insisting on personally overseeing the proceedings, issuing orders to doctors as though commanding troops. The child, a daughter, lived only a few hours before succumbing to the complications of early birth. Maria Josepha survived the ordeal, but the infection that set in afterward, compounded by exhaustion and despair, claimed her life within 3 weeks. What followed was perhaps the most grotesque display of Ferdinand's inability to accept reality. He refused to permit the burial of either mother or child, keeping the bodies in the palace while ordering his physicians to attempt resuscitation. For nearly a week, the air of the royal apartments grew heavy with the scent of decay, while the king clung to the belief that some combination of science and prayer might restore them. When at last he conceded defeat, he commissioned death masks of both, adding them to the growing collection of lost wives displayed in his private chamber. Spain, meanwhile, reeled. The treasury was nearly empty, the military overstretched, the colonies gone, and the king's court increasingly seen by foreign powers as a place of madness. Yet, astonishingly, the prospect of a fourth marriage soon arose. Maria Cristina of Naples, young, intelligent, and already pregnant by another man when she arrived in Madrid. That deception, and the strange arrangement that followed, would take Ferdinand's private life into territory so bizarre and so politically dangerous that even his most loyal courtiers would struggle to defend it. But that belongs to the next part of the story, when love, deceit, and dynastic desperation collide in the final act of the most perverted reign Spain had ever known. By the time the possibility of a fourth marriage was whispered through the corridors of the royal palace in late 1829, Ferdinand VII was no longer the vigorous, suspiciously smiling monarch he had been in his early years of restored rule. His body was slower now, his once quick temper tempered by exhaustion, yet sharpened in its paranoia, and his private chambers were filled with reminders of all that had gone wrong: the death masks of 3 wives, the collection of medical devices that had failed to solve his most intimate problem, and the faint but persistent scent of the herbs and oils once applied in futile hope. The proposed bride was Maria Cristina of Naples, young, intelligent, politically astute, and already carrying another man's child when negotiations for the marriage began. This fact, though not concealed from certain members of her own family, was kept from Ferdinand until the arrangements were sealed. When he learned it, he did not react with outrage, but with something stranger: relief. For a man who had spent decades trying to force nature to yield him an heir, the sudden prospect of a ready-made child, legitimate by marriage alone, was a temptation he could not refuse. And so, in a carefully staged ceremony that masked the unusual circumstances, Ferdinand and Maria Cristina were wed. To the public, it appeared as though Spain's long drought of succession had finally ended. In private, the arrangement was a labyrinth of mutual deception. Maria Cristina played the role of devoted wife, never speaking of the child's true paternity. Ferdinand played the role of confident father, though his eyes would often linger on the infant with a searching expression, as if willing some fragment of resemblance to emerge. The child, Isabella, born in 1830, became both the centerpiece of Ferdinand's renewed hope for his dynasty and the living reminder of his failure. Determined to claim her fully, he wrapped his household in layers of surveillance. The Queen's letters were intercepted, her visitors monitored, and her daily routine recorded in meticulous detail by servants who dared not defy the king's orders. Ferdinand's paranoia found new fuel in this arrangement. Though he had accepted the pregnancy as his salvation, he remained convinced that Maria Cristina might still be deceiving him in other ways, perhaps seeking lovers, perhaps conspiring with foreign courts, perhaps preparing to replace him altogether in Isabella's upbringing. He began conducting random inspections of her apartments, often bursting in at odd hours with armed guards, startling the Queen's ladies-in-waiting, and sometimes catching Maria Cristina in nothing more than a dressing gown. He had peepholes drilled into the walls adjoining their chambers, spending long periods silently watching her, not only in moments of potential intimacy, but during the most mundane acts, praying, reading, or simply staring into the middle distance. The Queen, aware of this constant observation, moved through her rooms with the studied composure of an actress who knew every gesture was part of a performance. The strain of this perpetual scrutiny took its toll. Her letters to her family in Naples, often intercepted before delivery, spoke of sleeplessness, of jumping at shadows, of feeling as though she lived in a glass box where every breath is measured. The king's surveillance extended beyond his wife to the entire palace. Guards were rotated daily so none could grow too comfortable. Food tasters were made to wait 30 minutes after sampling dishes to ensure no slow-acting poisons could slip through. Ministers were subjected to contradictory statements in private meetings, their responses carefully noted as evidence of loyalty or treachery. Within this atmosphere, the business of governing Spain became secondary to the business of managing Ferdinand's fears. Cabinet sessions were disrupted by sudden summons to investigate imagined conspiracies. Diplomatic negotiations stalled when the king became convinced that a visiting ambassador had used coded insults in his compliments to the Queen. Meanwhile, Isabella grew from a newborn into a lively child, the focus of both Ferdinand's pride and his gnawing doubt. He commissioned artists to paint her at various stages of infancy, then compared these portraits to his own and to those of men who had been near Maria Cristina in Naples. The question of paternity, unspoken in public, rotted quietly in his mind. At times, he embraced her with genuine affection. At other times, he regarded her as an intruder in his bloodline. He consulted genealogists, physiognomists, even astrologers, seeking some divine or scientific confirmation that the girl was truly his. Each offered answers vague enough to be interpreted in whatever way he needed at the moment, but none dispelled his suspicion. Entirely amid off this domestic theater, Spain itself staggered under economic crisis and political unrest. The loss of its American colonies had gutted its wealth, and unrest simmered in the provinces. Yet Ferdinand devoted more energy to orchestrating the Queen's daily routine than to stabilizing his kingdom. Secret passages were built so he could approach her unseen. Spies infiltrated her servants, and her reading material was censored to remove anything he deemed politically or morally dangerous. Even religious devotion became suspect. Was her increased time in the chapel genuine piety or a signal to hidden allies? Maria Cristina learned to survive by outward compliance and inward endurance. She performed her role, attended public functions with grace, and allowed Ferdinand to believe he had the upper hand, even as she quietly built her network of influence among sympathetic nobles and clergy. Yet the pressure was relentless. The king's health, undermined by decades of stress, began to falter. His digestion failed, his hands shook, and his once booming voice sometimes faltered into muttering. In 1832, his paranoia reached a grotesque extreme. Convinced that the Queen might poison him through physical contact, he ordered medical examinations before any private meeting between them, a final degradation that hollowed out whatever remained of their marital bond. By 1833, the man who had once returned to Madrid in triumph as the restorer of monarchy was a ghost within his palace, his mind consumed by the same obsessions that had warped his reign from the start: the need for an heir, the fear of betrayal, and the desperate maintenance of a fiction that had begun with a deception on his wedding day. The end, when it came, would be shaped as much by these private shadows as by the public failures that had made Spain a diminished and fractured power. And in the next part, as the final months of Ferdinand's life unfold, we will see how a lifetime of personal dysfunction left its mark not just on the king's body, but on the very soul of the kingdom. He ruled that by the opening months of 1833, the long and strange reign of Ferdinand VII had begun to shrink into the narrow confines of his private chambers, those dimly lit rooms where the air seemed permanently heavy with the mingled scents of candle wax, incense, and the medicinal oils that had once been part of his nightly rituals. He was only in his late 40s, but decades of strain, paranoia, and obsession had carved deep lines into his face, leaving the kind of expression one sees in men who have been fighting the same battle too long to remember when it began. His hands trembled when he reached for a goblet. His digestion was unreliable, and sometimes, when addressing ministers, his sentences wandered into half-coherent rambles about conspiracies that existed only in the echoing corridors of his mind. Those around him noticed a strange alternation in his moods, bursts of stubborn authority in which he demanded reports, signed decrees, and issued orders, followed by long silences in which he seemed to drift away entirely, staring at the death masks of his 3 dead wives as though waiting for them to speak. Maria Cristina, the 4th queen, now walked through the palace like a skilled performer balancing on a tightrope. She knew when to soothe him with reassurances, when to flatter his pride, and when to simply let his muttering run its course. But even she could see that the end was approaching. The king's body, never strong despite its imposing height, was succumbing to a catalogue of ailments, doubt swelling his joints until walking was painful, chronic fevers that came and went, without pattern, and a persistent wheeze that sometimes turned to gasping in the quiet hours before dawn. Yet his obsession with appearances remained. Visitors were ushered into rooms where the light was carefully arranged to flatter him, and he still insisted on wearing the heavy ceremonial uniforms that strained across his midsection, even if they left him short of breath. In the privacy of his bedchamber, he continued his strange nightly inspections of the queen's rooms, sometimes sitting silently in the shadows for an hour before returning to his own. At times, he would rouse guards in the middle of the night to change postings or search storage rooms for evidence of plots. The court physicians, long accustomed to his unpredictable commands, now found themselves dealing with the unpredictable decline of his health as well. They prescribed the usual treatments of the era: bleeding, cupping, herbal infusions, but Ferdinand, still convinced that his greatest vulnerability lay in his anatomy, continued to consult those who promised miracle cures for problems that had long since ceased to matter to anyone but him. He drank bitter brews of exotic roots said to restore vitality, wore amulets meant to balance the humors, and allowed a Neapolitan mystic to chant over him for hours in the belief that it would purge the body of invisible poisons. None of it eased the relentless wear on his frame. By late summer, even climbing the short staircase from his audience chamber to his private quarters left him winded. His paranoia, however, burned as brightly as ever. He suspected ministers of plotting to replace him with his brother Don Carlos, accused household staff of feeding information to foreign powers, and once ordered a full search of the palace kitchens because he had dreamed of poison being poured into his soup. It was around this time that he began speaking more openly about his legacy, not the laws he had passed or the wars he had fought, but the one thing he believed the world would never truly understand: the burden of his body. In conversations with his physicians, he instructed them that, upon his death, his most unique feature should be preserved for study, so that future generations might know the physical truth that had shaped his life. The doctors, who had spent years trying to manage the consequences of that truth, nodded in polite agreement, perhaps relieved that the king's thoughts had turned to posterity rather than daily interference. In September 1833, his health faltered sharply. The fevers became more frequent, the wheeze deepened, and the tremors in his hands sometimes spread to his whole body. Ministers pressed him to name Isabella as heir, formally securing the succession. before Don Carlos could challenge it. Ferdinand, alternately lucid and delirious, signed the necessary decrees, but insisted that he was not dying, and with the right regimen, the right prayers, and perhaps one more marriage, he might yet produce a son. Those who knew him well understood this was fantasy, but no one dared contradict him outright. On the evening of September 28th, he suffered a severe attack, likely a combination of heart failure and infection. For 2 days, he drifted in and out of consciousness, at times calling out for his long-dead wives, at times issuing garbled orders for investigations into imaginary plots. In the early hours of September 30th, Ferdinand VII died, his final breaths coming in the same bed where so many of his private dramas had played out. The official cause, as recorded for the public, was gout complicated by exhaustion. But within the palace, the physicians quietly agreed it was the inevitable collapse of a body and mind pushed far beyond their limits by decades of physical abnormality and political paranoia. As per his instructions, an autopsy was performed in secret. There, the truth that had been whispered for decades was confirmed in exacting detail. The organ that had been the subject of so much rumor measured an extraordinary 14 inches in length, its girth varying wildly from base to tip, with curvature, and scarring that rendered normal function nearly impossible. The scarring, some fresh and some decades old, revealed a hidden tragedy. Ferdinand had, over the years, attempted crude self-surgery in misguided efforts to correct his shape, leaving behind evidence of repeated injury and infection. These findings, along with detailed anatomical sketches, were sealed away in the Vatican archives, considered too politically and morally explosive for public release. The organ itself was preserved in a jar of alcohol, a relic of one man's lifelong struggle with a body he could neither change nor accept, and of a reign whose failures were bound up in the same story. In the days following his death, Maria Cristina moved quickly to secure Isabella's position as queen, knowing that the stability of the crown rested on a fiction that could never be publicly acknowledged. Outside the palace, the people of Madrid mourned with a complicated mix of relief and sorrow. Some wept for the monarch they had restored after Napoleon's defeat. Others quietly celebrated the end of a rule marked by repression, suspicion, and missed opportunities. In the years to come, Ferdinand's reign would be remembered not for great victories or visionary reforms, but for the way one man's private condition had seeped into the fabric of national life, distorting decisions, fueling paranoia, and leaving Spain weaker than it had been for centuries. Yet the most curious part of his legacy was hidden from public view, locked away in a vault where only a handful of scholars would ever see it. And it is there, in that strange intersection between the intimate and the political, that the next part of this story lies, in how the kingdom he left behind struggled under the weight of secrets it could never speak aloud. The death of Ferdinand, 7 in September 1833, did not bring an end to the strange, suffocating atmosphere he had cultivated inside the royal palace. In many ways, it simply shifted the weight of it onto other shoulders. His widow, Maria Cristina of Naples, now stood at the center of a precarious balancing act, ruling as regent for her young daughter Isabella, while defending both of them against political enemies who doubted the child's legitimacy and sought to place Ferdinand's brother, Don Carlos, on the throne instead. The irony was bitter. Isabella's disputed paternity was the very reason she could inherit it all. Yet, it was also the seed of the Carlist claim that she had no right to rule. Within hours of Ferdinand's passing, Maria Cristina moved with quiet urgency, securing the palace gates, summoning loyal ministers, and issuing proclamations in Isabella's name. The courtyards that had so often echoed with the king's unpredictable inspections were now filled with guards whose loyalty was measured in years of service to the queen rather than to the dead monarch. In private, Maria Christina allowed herself no indulgence in grief. She had long since made peace with the idea that her marriage to Ferdinand had been a performance more than a partnership, a carefully constructed fiction in which both parties had pretended to believe for the sake of the crown. But she had also learned from him, learned the value of controlling access, of using surveillance as a political tool, and of never allowing rivals to sense hesitation. Ministers who had grown accustomed to Ferdinand's erratic rule now found in Maria Christina a more calculating presence. She did not burst into rooms in the middle of the night, nor did she summon astrologers to advise on military strategy, but she did quietly instruct her household to keep careful records of which nobles visited whom, of who lingered too long, in conversation, of which ambassadors sent too many letters back to their governments. Outside the palace, Spain's political climate was brittle. The country was deeply divided between the liberals who supported Isabella's succession under the new pragmatic sanction and the Carlists who rallied to Don Carlos, insisting on the traditional male-only inheritance. In coffeehouses and on street corners, the debates were loud and sometimes bloody, while in the salons of Madrid, the talk was more delicate but no less charged. Carlist pamphlets hinted darkly at the Neapolitan stain on the royal bloodline, a phrase that needed no further explanation to those aware of the rumors surrounding Isabella's conception. Maria Christina ignored these whispers in public, but worked tirelessly behind the scenes to counter them. She arranged public appearances where the young queen was presented as the living image of her late father, carefully dressed and posed to emphasize any resemblance that could be claimed. Court painters were instructed to soften certain features in their portraits, to tilt the angle of Isabella's face so that her brow or jaw might faintly echo Ferdinand's. These portraits were then circulated to foreign courts alongside formal letters affirming the legitimacy of the succession. Meanwhile, the late king's more intimate legacy was quietly dealt with. The physicians who had performed the autopsy and preserved the anatomical specimen understood that its existence was both a historical curiosity and a political danger. Maria Christina ordered the matter sealed under church authority, ensuring that no foreign ambassador or domestic rival could use it to humiliate the crown. The preserved organ, the medical sketches, and the written descriptions were locked away in the Vatican archives, beyond the reach of Carlist propaganda. Yet even without direct evidence, the whispers continued. In certain private gatherings, nobles would smirk over their wine and suggest that Spain's new queen regent had more in common with a stage actress than a monarch, implying that her greatest political skill had been casting herself in the role of loyal wife long enough to secure her daughter's throne. Maria Christina, aware of these undercurrents, countered them not with confrontation, but with an unyielding program of appearances, alliances, and careful manipulation of public memory. She began to rewrite Ferdinand's image, commissioning histories that glossed over his eccentricities and emphasized his restoration of Spanish sovereignty after Napoleon. In these accounts, the king was a flawed but devoted monarch, a man whose reign had been shaped by the turbulence of his times rather than by the private burdens he carried. At the same time, she selectively adopted some of his methods, not the bizarre bedroom rituals or the compulsive inspections, but the understanding that information was power. She kept her network of informants, making her one of the best informed rulers in Europe, despite the fragility of her position. The court itself began to change under her influence. The tense, suspicious air of Ferdinand's final years gave way to a quieter, more disciplined order. There were fewer sudden dismissals of servants, fewer dramatic accusations hurled across council tables, and far fewer nocturnal disruptions. But the undercurrent of watchfulness remained, now channeled into the political necessity of protecting Isabella's reign. In some ways, this transition marked the moment when Ferdinand's most destructive habits, his obsession with control, his need to manage every detail of those closest to him, were stripped of their eccentricities and repurposed into tools of governance. Yet the shadow of his reign lingered. In the provinces, rebels invoked his name as a tyrant whose private shame had left Spain leaderless for years. While in Madrid, some still toasted him as the king who had restored the monarchy after the chaos of the French invasion. For Maria Cristina, the challenge was to keep both views alive in just the right balance. To let Ferdinand be remembered enough to legitimize Isabella, but not so vividly that the more grotesque truths resurfaced. This delicate balancing act defined the first months of her regency, a time when every decision felt like a move in a game whose rules could shift without warning. And while the battles of the Carlist Wars loomed on the horizon, threatening to decide the fate of the monarchy on the battlefield rather than in the council chamber, the palace itself remained the quiet stage where the most careful and dangerous performances were still being played. In the next part, we will step deeper into that stagecraft, into the opening moves of a Carlist conflict, the calculated displays of Isabella as the rightful heir, and the lingering question of whether the kingdom could ever truly escape the strange legacy of the most perverted king in its history. By the winter of 1833, barely 3 months after Ferdinand VII's death, the air in Madrid carried the strange mix of tension and ceremony that comes when a kingdom is both in mourning and bracing for conflict. Isabella II was now queen in name, a child barely able to walk, holding a crown too heavy for her small head. And her mother, Maria Cristina, was the regent in all but title, a woman whose authority rested on the thinnest of supports: the official acceptance of her daughter's legitimacy, the loyalty of enough generals to deter open rebellion, and the ability to keep the volatile factions of Spain from tearing the monarchy apart. Yet outside the palace, in the villages and cities of Castile, Aragon, Navarre, and the Basque Country, another name was rising like a war cry: Don Carlos, Ferdinand's brother, the man who insisted that by the ancient laws of succession, the crown was rightfully his. It was the opening chapter of what became known as the First Carlist War, but beneath the politics, the old king's shadow still stretched long over every argument. In the taverns, the Carlist loyalists spoke, in blunt, mocking terms. Why should we take orders from the bastard daughter of a Neapolitan girl? A crude summary of the rumors that had haunted Isabella's birth since the day she was swaddled in silk. Among liberals, there was equal unease, though for different reasons. They remembered Ferdinand not as a tragic, misunderstood monarch, but as a man whose paranoia had stalled reforms and whose fixation on his bodily shame had left the country ungoverned in critical years. Maria Cristina, aware that she was fighting on two fronts, one of bloodline, one of politics, responded with a campaign as carefully staged as any court ritual her late husband had ever devised. Public appearances were meticulously planned. When Isabella was shown to the people, she wore dresses with colors echoing the Bourbon coat of arms, and her hair was arranged in ways that flattered the faint resemblance to Ferdinand that court painters had learned to enhance in portraits. Every outing was accompanied by ministers and bishops who spoke loudly enough for nearby citizens to overhear phrases like "the late king's likeness" and "his blessed daughter." The Queen Regent herself adopted a posture of unshakable confidence, speaking of "my husband the king" in ways that blurred memory into present reality. Behind the scenes, however, the work was far more delicate. Letters from provincial governors warned of Carlist gatherings that were more than just talk. Priests giving sermons in favor of Don Carlos, militias drilling in secret. Maria Cristina's council debated whether to move swiftly with arrests, or to let some of these groups expose themselves fully before striking. At the same time, she had to manage the diplomatic chessboard. France and Britain, both wary of the reactionary politics of Don Carlos, were inclined to support Isabella, but they needed assurance that the regency would not collapse at the first serious challenge. The regent's ambassadors abroad worked to downplay the intensity of the domestic crisis, framing the Carlist movement as an isolated rebellion rather than a national divide. But even as she played the stateswoman, Maria Cristina was not above using some of the tools she had inherited from Ferdinand's darker repertoire. She maintained a network of informants within Madrid and beyond, with reports flowing back to the palace about who met with whom, which noble families were quietly sending money to the Carlist cause, and which newspapers printed editorials in dangerously ambiguous language. Ministers who expressed too much doubt about the regency's stability found themselves replaced with men more pliable or more indebted to the Queen's favor. And though she did not share Ferdinand's penchant for sudden midnight inspections, she did quietly order the searching of certain houses under the cover of darkness, just as he had once prowled the palace corridors in search of imagined plots. The irony was that even as she worked to distance her rule from his eccentricities, she found herself adopting some of his habits out of sheer necessity. The war itself began not with a dramatic battle, but with a series of skirmishes in the rugged northern provinces where Don Carlos enjoyed the most support. There, in the misty hills and narrow valleys, the Carlist militias moved like shadows, avoiding open confrontation with the better-equipped royal army and instead relying on ambushes, raids, and the deep-rooted loyalties of local villages. For the regent, these early months were a test of endurance. Supplies had to be sent north, generals had to be persuaded to stay loyal, and each victory had to be publicized in Madrid as proof that Isabella's crown was secure. Yet for every small success, there was an equal and opposite setback. Supply train intercepted, a garrison switching sides, a local bishop blessing Carlist banners. Through it all, Ferdinand's private legacy was never far from the surface. In Carlist propaganda, his reign was portrayed as a cautionary tale, a warning of what happens when the natural order is defied. They did not name his condition outright. Propriety demanded at least a thin veil of discretion, but the insinuations were clear enough that everyone knew what was meant. The regent's allies responded in kind, producing pamphlets that emphasized Ferdinand's role in resisting Napoleon and restoring the monarchy, carefully omitting the details of his domestic life that had drained his rule of vitality. In the quiet moments between council meetings and audiences, Maria Cristina must have felt the strangeness of it, that she was fighting to protect a throne whose recent occupant had been as much a liability as a king, and that she was forced to use his memory both as a shield and as a weapon. The palace itself still carried traces of him. The hidden corridors, the mirrored angles meant to catch spies, the sense that every gesture might be watched. Servants who had endured his reign sometimes caught themselves glancing at the peepholes he had ordered drilled into walls, even though they were now sealed. And in a vault hundreds of miles away, in the guarded archives of the Vatican, the most private artifact of his life sat preserved in glass and alcohol, a silent witness to the peculiar link between a man's body and the fate of his country. The war was only beginning, and the regent knew it would be long, costly, and uncertain. But for now, she held the advantage. The capital was secure, the army was largely loyal, and Isabella was still the crowned child at the center of it all. The real question was whether that fragile center could hold as the Carlist challenge grew more organized, more ruthless, and more determined to tear open the secrets Maria Cristina had worked so hard to keep buried. And in the next part, as the first true battles of the war erupt and the propaganda war turns even more personal, we will see how the shadow of Ferdinand VII's strange and scandalous reign refused to fade, even in the roar of musket fire got by the spring of 1834. The First Carlist War had moved beyond whispers and skirmishes into something heavier, a slow-burning conflict that wrapped itself around the mountains and valleys of northern Spain like a stubborn mist that refused to lift. The regent, Maria Cristina, found herself presiding over a kingdom that was at once deeply fragile and yet strangely resilient. Its capital still steady, its army still marching, but its edges fraying in ways that were difficult to mend. The Carlist strongholds in Navarre and the Basque country pulsed with activity, their militias drawing strength from local loyalty, religious fervor, and a romanticized vision of true monarchy that painted Don Carlos as the rightful king and Maria Christina's regency as an illegitimate imposture. And yet, beneath the political slogans and banners, the propaganda war was turning more personal and more poisonous. The memory of Ferdinand VII was being reshaped, sharpened, and hurled like a spear into the heart of public opinion. Carlist pamphlets, often printed in crude woodcut illustrations, hinted at the private shame that had haunted Ferdinand's life. They never spoke plainly. Propriety and the fear of outright scandal kept their words wrapped in metaphor, but the meaning was clear enough for those who wanted to hear it. Drawings showed a king in a heavy robe dragging an enormous, distorted scepter that bent awkwardly at the tip. Others depicted a royal cradle standing empty beneath a canopy embroidered with question marks. In taverns and marketplaces, these images became talking points, fueling laughter in some quarters and outrage in others. The regent's supporters countered with their narratives, painting Ferdinand as a misunderstood monarch whose difficulties had been exaggerated by his enemies. Their pamphlets showed him as the steadfast king who had stood against Napoleon, who had restored the Bourbon crown, who had died ensuring his daughter's inheritance. They were careful never to deny the rumors outright. To do so would have risked giving them more attention, but they wrapped them in layers of heroism, as if to say, yes, he suffered, but he ruled anyway. This battle over memory was not just about history. It was about the present war. If Ferdinand could be remembered as a legitimate, if flawed, king, then Isabella's legitimacy held. If he could be mocked as a man whose crown had been as empty as his cradle, then Don Carlos's claim gained weight. Maria Cristina, acutely aware of the stakes, wove these considerations into her strategy. She approved state-sponsored plays that dramatized Ferdinand's return to Spain after Napoleon's defeat, staged in a way that emphasized his determination and loyalty rather than his later paranoia. She ordered public ceremonies at Ferdinand's tomb, with bishops offering prayers for the noble father of our beloved queen, creating spectacles that fused religion, monarchy, and memory into a single, untouchable image. Yet the war on the ground was far less controlled. In the Basque Hills, Carlist fighters, known as requetes, ambushed royalist convoys, melting into forests before the soldiers could retaliate. In Catalonia, guerrilla bands disrupted supply lines, and in Aragon, entire villages declared. For Don Carlos, forcing the regent's generals to split their forces into smaller, more vulnerable units. Reports reached Madrid of Carlist priests telling congregations that Isabella's very existence was a sign of God's displeasure, a punishment for Spain's tolerance of an illegitimate heir. The regent's council debated whether to prosecute such sermons as treason, but the political cost of arresting clergymen was high, and the church's support was still essential to the regency's survival. Through all of this, the shadow of Ferdinand's peculiar legacy remained. The Carlists could not resist twisting it into an emblem of their cause, and the regent could not entirely erase it from the public mind. Even in the royal army, where loyalty to Isabella was sworn under oath, soldiers repeated crude jokes about the king who could not plant what he wished to grow, a phrase that slipped easily between barracks humor and political insult. Maria Cristina responded in part by cultivating an image of herself as the moral anchor of the monarchy, a contrast to Ferdinand's excesses. She was seen attending Mass daily, overseeing her daughter's education personally, and meeting with ministers in sessions described by observers as calm, efficient, and devoid of the emotional outbursts that had marked her husband's reign. But even in this, there was a calculated echo of Ferdinand's methods. She still relied on a network of informants, still kept files on potential rivals, and manipulated appearances to suit her political needs. In the quiet halls of the palace, the older servants who had survived multiple reigns recognized the pattern. The corridors still felt watched, though the eyes were different now, less fevered, more deliberate, but no less intent on control. Outside those walls, the war showed no signs of ending quickly. Each victory for the Royalists was matched by a Carlist counterattack, and each Carlist setback only hardened their resolve. The regent knew that the longer the conflict dragged on, the more dangerous the propaganda became. It was not enough to win on the battlefield. She had to win the story of the war as well. And so, as the spring gave way to the long, hot summer of 1834, Maria Cristina doubled down on her dual campaign, fighting with soldiers in the field and with carefully crafted words, images, and ceremonies in the cities. The danger was clear. Should either front collapse, so too would Isabella's fragile claim. And in the next part, as the Carlist forces launch a series of coordinated assaults, and the regent's hold on the capital is tested, the memory of Ferdinand VII, twisted, defended, and fought over, will prove to be as much a weapon as any musket or saber dot by the late summer of 1834. The First Carlist War had reached a stage where the fighting could no longer be dismissed as scattered rebellion. It had hardened into a real war, with battle lines, strongholds, and strategies that demanded the regent's full attention, though Maria Cristina never forgot that the war was being waged in two theaters at once: the physical terrain of Spain's hills and valleys, and the more treacherous landscape of memory and perception. The Carlists had become adept at making every military gain double as a political statement, framing each captured village as proof of Don Carlos's divine right, each royalist retreat as confirmation that God did not bless the rule of the Neapolitan widow and her doubtful child. Meanwhile, Maria Cristina's ministers understood that the capital had to feel secure at all costs. Even the hint of instability in Madrid could send the city's volatile public into dangerous currents. The regent's daily routine became a careful balance between military briefings, ceremonial appearances, and the constant crafting of a narrative that could hold the country together. When news came that the Carlists had taken several small but symbolically important towns in Navarre, the regent ordered a series of public masses in Madrid, each framed as a thanksgiving for the courage of our loyal defenders, a subtle reframing of loss into an opportunity for public solidarity. Court painters were dispatched to the front to capture heroic scenes of royalist troops holding ground, and these images were quickly copied into engravings and distributed across Spain. Yet the Carlists countered with their imagery, much cruder, but often more potent. Woodcut broadsheets depicting a cradle toppling over while a crown rolled into the hands of Don Carlos, or shadowy figures suggesting the secret truth of Isabella's birth. They could not openly name Ferdinand's anatomical legacy without scandal, but their metaphors, a bent sword, a broken plow, a barren orchard, were understood by everyone. These insults carried into the soldiers' camps, where rough humor mixed with political resentment. Reports reached the regent that some Carlist fighters referred to the royalist army as the Queen's gardeners, a mocking nod to the idea that they were tending a throne grown from infertile soil. Maria Cristina trained for years in Ferdinand's palace to monitor even the smallest threat, took such rumors seriously. She increased her control over the press, authorizing editors to print only government-approved updates on the war, and quietly suppressing any stories that touched on the legitimacy question. She also leaned more heavily on religious authority, arranging for bishops to issue pastoral letters declaring loyalty to Isabella as a sacred duty, to be read aloud in churches on Sundays. Still, the war's military reality could not be ignored. Carlist forces, under capable commanders, like Thomas de Zumalagarwi, began coordinating attacks with precision, seizing supplies and avoiding pitched battles they were unlikely to win. The region's generals struggled to adapt to this style of warfare, finding themselves stretched thin across rugged terrain where local support often favored the Carlists. In Madrid, Maria Cristina faced the delicate task of keeping her generals loyal despite setbacks. She understood that a commander's loyalty could be as fragile as the morale of his troops, and so she mixed rewards with subtle reminders of dependence, land grants here, titles there, paired with carefully placed informants who would report any sign of wavering. In this way, she mirrored some of Ferdinand's old tactics, though stripped of his volatile temper and personal paranoia. Yet, despite the region's careful management, the constant stress began to show. Those who saw her daily noted the slight hollows forming beneath her eyes, the way she sometimes pressed her hand to her temple during long council meetings, the moments when her voice, usually calm and deliberate, would grow sharper than intended. She knew she was walking a narrow path. To falter in public would embolden the Carlists. To appear too forceful could alienate moderate allies. And always, the late king's shadow stretched across the battlefield, his name invoked by both sides, his flaws either smoothed over into patriotic myth or sharpened into a weapon of ridicule. In the royalist telling, Ferdinand was the king who had endured Napoleon's armies and returned to claim his throne, a father whose final act was to secure the crown for his beloved daughter. In the Carlist version, he was a ruler whose throne and marriage bed alike had been empty of true heirs, leaving Spain vulnerable to the ambitions of others. The truth, of course, was more complicated than either side dared admit, bound up in the strange, painful reality of a man whose most private struggle had become a public matter of succession. And so the war went on, each musket shot echoed by a whisper, each victory or defeat reshaped in the telling. Maria Cristina understood that this was not a war that could be won by force alone. It was a contest over what Spain would choose to believe about itself, about its monarchy, and about the man whose reign had brought it to this point. As autumn approached and the first hints of winter crept into the northern air, both armies prepared for the next phase, one that would test not just their endurance, but the region's ability to keep the fragile fiction of legitimacy intact. In the next part, we will follow these preparations into the bitter months ahead, where cold weather and colder politics will shape the war, and where Ferdinand's ghost will linger not just in memory, but in the decisions that determine the fate of his daughter's crown. By the onset of winter in late 1834, the Carlist War had taken on the stubborn rhythm of a conflict neither side could win quickly, and both sides knew it. The snow dusted the high passes of Navarre and the Basque country, muting the sound of marching boots and musket drills, while in Madrid, the cold settled into the marble halls of the royal palace like an uninvited guest. Maria Cristina's court moved more slowly in the shortened days, yet the regent herself could not afford to. Each morning began with military dispatches laid out beside her breakfast, the ink often smudged by the frozen hands of the couriers who had carried them down from the north. Each evening ended with strategy meetings that blended practical military concerns with the quieter but equally important battle for the monarchy's legitimacy. Outside the palace, Madrid was restless. Bread prices had risen sharply, and rumors about the cost of the war were as common in the marketplaces as the gossip about the Queen Regent's personal life. The Carlist underground in the capital fed both streams of discontent, distributing pamphlets that accused Maria Cristina of neglecting the people's needs while funding a war for a crown that did not truly belong to her daughter. There, imagery had grown bolder. Woodcuts now showed a queen holding a child whose face was blank, the empty oval a provocation to the viewer's imagination. Another depicted Ferdinand himself as a shadow looming over the palace, his misshapen scepter, drooping in one hand while the other pointed accusingly toward Isabella's crib. These were crude but effective pieces of propaganda, and though the regent's censors confiscated them where they could, enough slipped through to keep the rumors alive. In response, Maria Christina's supporters doubled their efforts to present Isabella as the embodiment of continuity. Public processions were staged even in the cold, with the young queen bundled in rich velvet, waving from a gilded carriage. Priests blessed her from cathedral steps, soldiers saluted as she passed, and loyalist newspapers ran breathless accounts of the people's devotion. The regent understood that these ceremonies did not just affirm the crown's legitimacy. They also bought her time, reassuring foreign allies that the capital remained steady. Yet she could feel the war's strain in other ways. Reports from the front told of dwindling supplies, of soldiers forced to shelter in abandoned farmhouses, of frostbite claiming more men than musket balls. The Carlists, familiar with the terrain, used the winter to their advantage, moving quickly between sympathetic villages, striking isolated royalist units, and disappearing again into snow-covered forests. Maria Christina's generals urged her to concentrate forces for a decisive winter offensive, but she hesitated. A failed offensive could embolden Don Carlos's cause beyond repair, and every decision she made had to balance military ambition with political survival. In private, she admitted to her closest advisors that she sometimes felt Ferdinand's ghost hovering over the council table, not in the sentimental sense, but as a reminder of how much of this war's foundation had been laid during his reign. His inability to produce a clear, undisputed heir had created the opening for Don Carlos's challenge, and his paranoia had left her a court trained to look for enemies everywhere, a skill that was useful, but exhausting. She had inherited not just a throne and a child, but a political culture steeped in suspicion, secrecy, and the belief that power could be maintained only by constant vigilance. That culture shaped her every move now, from the choice of which generals to trust with new orders to the decision to quietly replace the head of the postal service after intercepted letters hinted at Carlist sympathies. Even the palace kitchens were not beyond her notice. Food tasters, a holdover from Ferdinand's most paranoid years, still sampled each dish served to her and Isabella, and the tasters themselves were rotated regularly to prevent bribery. The Queen's personal life remained a target for gossip. Some whispered that she had taken lovers among her ministers, while others suggested that she was too devoted to her daughter to consider remarriage, both narratives twisted in the pamphlets to undermine her moral authority. Maria Christina did not respond to these stories directly, but she countered them by projecting an image of serene domesticity, peering in carefully arranged portraits seated beside Isabella at her lessons or embroidering in a sunlit room. The picture of maternal virtue. The winter months were a test of endurance for the entire kingdom. In the provinces, families huddled in stone houses, rationing grain while the war's demands drained local treasuries. In the cities, tensions simmered between those who supported the regency and those who saw the Carlists as a return to a more traditional, if rigid, order. And through it all, Ferdinand's name persisted like a refrain. In Carlist sermons, he was the broken reed whose weakness had led Spain astray. In Loyalist speeches, he was the steady hand who had restored the monarchy after Napoleon's depredations. Neither image was fully true, but truth mattered less than usefulness. Maria Christina understood this better than anyone, and she wielded Ferdinand's memory with care, invoking it when it served to strengthen Isabella's claim, and ignoring it when it threatened to remind people of the peculiar details that had once been whispered in every court across Europe. As 1835 approached, the regent knew that the coming year would demand even more of her, not just in military decisions, but in the constant, delicate shaping of public belief. And in the next part, As the war shifts into a new phase, with foreign involvement and the Carlists pushing harder than ever, the fragile balance she has maintained will be tested in ways that could either secure Isabella's throne or shatter it entirely. By the opening weeks of 1835, Spain was no longer fighting the First Carlist War alone. The cold winter months had not stopped the exchanges of fire in the northern provinces, but they had slowed them enough for a different kind of maneuvering to take place, the kind conducted in embassy drawing rooms and over-coded correspondence. Britain, ever watchful for ways to curb reactionary monarchism on the continent, had begun to send quiet assurances of support to Maria Cristina, while France, concerned about the potential spread of Carlist influence along its border with the Basque Country, was cautiously aligning itself with the regent as well. Both powers saw in Isabella's regency not so much a noble cause as a practical barrier against the return of ultra-conservative absolutism. Their interest was not entirely altruistic. British merchants eyed Spain's markets, and French generals preferred a weak but stable neighbor to a fractured one that might export rebellion. In Madrid, Maria Cristina's ministers understood the value of foreign backing, not just for material aid, but for the optics. If the great powers treated Isabella as queen, it became harder for the Carlists to paint her as an impostor. The regent worked these alliances with quiet skill, sending envoys who could speak both the language of diplomacy and the subtler language of reassurance, promising reforms palatable to liberal sensibilities abroad while maintaining enough traditional trappings to keep the church from abandoning her at home. Yet every gain abroad risked a loss in the provinces, where foreign intervention could be twisted into proof that the regency was a puppet of outsiders. Carlist pamphlets began to seize on this angle, depicting the Queen Regent not as the guardian of Spain's future, but as a marionette pulled by English and French strings. One particularly biting caricature showed her seated on a throne with two crowns hovering above, one labeled London, the other Paris, while a tiny child, Isabella, clutched a doll wearing the Bourbon fleur-de-lis, its head turned away as if in shame. The messaging was simple and effective. Foreign support meant foreign control, and foreign control meant betrayal of Spain's soul. Maria Cristina countered with her narrative, commissioning Prince of Isabella receiving blessings from Spanish bishops or standing beside regiments sworn to the national flag. These images were designed to anchor the monarchy's image in Spanish soil, to remind citizens that the crown was not an imported ornament, but a native inheritance. Still, she could not escape the shadow of Ferdinand's reign. The Carlists continued to weave their peculiar legacy into their propaganda, using it as a symbol of dynastic weakness. They rarely risked outright indecency in their depictions. The conventions of the time still demanded a veil over such things, but the metaphors grew sharper. Ferdinand became the king of the empty cradle, the orchard without fruit, the plow without seed. These phrases, passed from mouth to mouth in taverns and soldiers' camps, carried a sting that official proclamations could not. Easily dull. Among her allies, the regent was advised to ignore the insults entirely, to let them dissipate without response. But she knew better. In a war fought as much in the mind as on the field, a rumor ignored was often a rumor confirmed. So she chose subtle rebuttals, moments in public ceremonies where Isabella would be presented alongside symbols of fertility and growth, blooming flowers in spring processions, baskets of grain in harvest festivals. Small visual cues meant to counteract the whispered suggestions of barrenness. Meanwhile, the fighting itself intensified in bursts. Carlist commanders, emboldened by local successes, launched coordinated raids that disrupted royalist supply lines. The regent's generals pleaded for more troops and more funds, both of which were in short supply. Foreign advisors began to suggest that Britain and France might commit volunteer forces, though this risked inflaming nationalist sentiment against the regency. Maria Cristina walked a careful line, accepting quiet shipments of arms and money, while avoiding any formal treaties that could be used to brand her as a foreign puppet. Inside the palace, the atmosphere was one of constant watchfulness. The regent's guard was expanded. Her routes to public events varied without notice, and her correspondence with provincial governors was encrypted to prevent interception. Those who had served under Ferdinand saw familiar patterns: the same careful vetting of servants, the same obsession with controlling information, though under Maria Cristina, these measures were applied with method rather than fever. Yet for all her discipline, the strain was visible in her eyes, in the tightness of her smile when she faced the crowds. The regency was holding, but it was a holding pattern that could not last forever. She knew the Carlists were waiting for one decisive blow, either military or political, to break her. And she knew that if such a blow came, it would not be aimed only at the battlefield. It would strike at the heart of the monarchy's image, dredging up every whisper about Ferdinand's private life, every insinuation about Isabella's birth, and casting them as proof that the crown itself had been compromised long before a shot was fired. In the next part, we will see how the spring of 1835 brought both opportunity and danger. A chance for the regent to tighten her grip through reforms and alliances, and the risk that in doing so, she might provoke the very storm she had worked so hard to keep at bay. By the spring of 1835, the frozen stillness that had hung over much of the First Carlist War began to thaw, and with it came movement, not just in the mountain passes and river valleys of the north, but in the restless currents of Madrid's political life. The regent, Maria Cristina, sensed that the coming months would be decisive. Winter had given both sides time to regroup, and while the Carlists had used the lull to consolidate their hold over loyal provinces, train recruits, and deepen their supply networks, the royalist government had been equally busy strengthening foreign connections, reorganizing garrisons, and carefully managing the fragile alliance between moderate liberals and conservative monarchists who supported Isabella's claim. The regent knew that military victory alone would not secure the throne. The war was as much about perception as about territory, and the perception was a constant battleground. The Carlists were still working Ferdinand VII's memory like a craftsman shapes clay, pressing it into whatever form suited the argument of the day. In their telling, Ferdinand's reign was either a cautionary tale of divine punishment for breaking the natural succession, or an era of weakness that had left Spain defenseless against foreign manipulation, even when they avoided the sharpest insinuations about his private life. The allusions were unmistakable. A Carlist broadside circulated in Navarre depicted a barren tree, its twisted trunk labeled El Rey, its only fruit a single apple marked with a question mark, guarded by a woman in Neapolitan dress. The regent's counter-narrative was subtler. She approved new coinage bearing Isabella's youthful profile on one side and Ferdinand's on the other, a visual pairing meant to link father and daughter inseparably in the public mind. She ordered the minting of medallions commemorating Ferdinand's restoration of the Spanish throne, distributing them to soldiers, clergy, and municipal leaders, tokens meant to be both keepsake and reminder that loyalty to Isabella was loyalty to her father's legacy. On the battlefield, the royalists attempted a series of coordinated spring offensives designed to reclaim key towns in the Basque Country and Navarre. Some met with success, particularly where foreign-supplied arms tipped the balance, but others faltered in the face of the Carlists' familiarity with the terrain. The fighting was often brutal in its intimacy: ambushes in narrow mountain passes, sudden skirmishes in village streets, and swift retreats into forests that swallowed up whole units. Reports of atrocities on both sides trickled back to Madrid, where they were either suppressed or reframed, depending on the political need. Royalist newspapers spoke of firm justice against traitors. Carlist pamphlets described defense of the faith, against invaders. In the capital, the regents, political balancing act grew more difficult. Liberals pressed for constitutional reforms in exchange for continued support, while conservatives demanded the preservation of traditional privileges. Maria Cristina had to give each faction just enough to keep them in the fold without alienating the other, a skill she had learned from years of surviving Ferdinand's unpredictable court. Yet the strain was visible in private. Those closest to her noted that she slept less, rising earlier to read dispatches, sometimes pacing her chambers, with a letter in hand as if weighing each word for its potential danger. Her awareness of Ferdinand's legacy remained acute. She knew the Carlists would use it at the first sign of weakness. Thus, she leaned heavily on ceremonial acts that placed Isabella within a continuum of Bourbon history. She organized a pilgrimage to Ferdinand's tomb, where the regent, clad in black, knelt with Isabella before the marble and prayed for guidance from the Father who gave Spain back her crown. The event was reported widely, the image of mother and daughter framed as a moment of national unity, though those who had known Ferdinand personally might have seen in it an irony too sharp to ignore. Meanwhile, the propaganda war intensified. Carlist agents in Madrid distributed clandestine leaflets at night, slipping them under doors and into market stalls. One particularly stinging piece showed Ferdinand as a ghost, shackled to a massive, distorted key that he could not fit into the lock of a nursery door, a biting metaphor that needed no explanation. The regent's supporters retaliated with broadsheets showing Ferdinand handing a golden crown to Isabella, his face serene, hers radiant with the promise of the future. Both images were lies in their way, yet both carried the weight of belief. The spring also brought an increase in foreign involvement, though always in the shadows. British rifles and French artillery quietly arrived in royalist ports, accompanied by volunteer officers who officially came on their initiative, but in reality followed the whispered instructions of their governments. Their presence boosted morale in some units and sparked resentment in others. The tension between gratitude and suspicion was never far from the surface. Maria Cristina understood the risks but accepted them. Without external aid, the war could drag on indefinitely, eroding her position with each passing month. Still, she never allowed foreign troops to march openly under their flags, insisting that they blend into Spanish units to preserve the illusion of sovereign control. By late spring, the pace of the conflict was quickening again. Villages changed. Hands in days, roads became dangerous even for heavily guarded convoys, and both armies sought decisive engagements that remained stubbornly out of reach. Through it all, Ferdinand's presence, not the man himself, but the shadow of his life, lingered over every political calculation, every act of ceremony, every scrap of paper printed in the name of the war. The regent knew she could not banish that shadow. She could only shape it to her advantage. But the question remained, how long could that shaping hold before the Carlists found a way to twist it beyond her control? And in the next part, as summer heats both the battlefields and the rhetoric, we will see how the Regency's grip on the capital is tested by unrest from within as much as by the enemy, without doubt by the summer of 1835. The heat over Madrid seemed to draw every scent and sound upward into the heavy air, the acrid smoke from blacksmith forges making weapons for the royalist forces, the mingled aromas of roasting meat and unwashed bodies in the crowded markets, the distant bells calling the devout to prayer. The city was alive but uneasy, for the war in the north was not going as swiftly as the regent's proclamation suggested, and the longer it dragged on, the more cracks appeared in the coalition. That kept her in power. Inside the royal palace, Maria Cristina could feel the tension tightening around her like a silken cord. The liberals, who had lent her their support in the hope of political reform, were growing impatient, pressing for tangible changes in governance as the price for their continued loyalty. The conservatives, meanwhile, whispered that she was too close to the liberals, that foreign advisers were whispering in her ear, that the monarchy's sacred traditions were being bartered away piece by piece. In this charged atmosphere, the Carlists seized their chance to sow unrest inside the capital itself. Agents slipped among the taverns and public squares, spreading rumors that the regent planned to flee to France with her daughter, leaving Spain to foreign control. Others told a darker tale, that Isabella was sickly, and the regency was hiding the truth, preparing to replace her with a more suitable heir. Both stories, though baseless, carried just enough plausibility to unsettle the public. And always, beneath these rumors, ran the deeper current of Ferdinand's legacy. Carlist pamphlets distributed in Madrid were bolder now, their metaphors more pointed. One showed Ferdinand seated on a throne that slowly melted away beneath him, his crown slipping into the hands of a faceless child, a child whose shadow revealed horns. Another depicted the royal orchard with a single malformed tree, its roots tangled in foreign flags. These images did not need captions. Their meaning was understood instantly by those who had heard the whispers of the old king's condition. Maria Cristina responded with a campaign of her own, ordering public celebrations for Isabella's 5th birthday. The event was staged with theatrical precision, the little queen riding in an open carriage drawn by white horses, smiling shyly, and clutching a bouquet of roses, flanked by guards in immaculate dress uniforms. Crowds were encouraged to cheer. Coins bearing Ferdinand's and Isabella's profiles were handed out, and royalist newspapers the next morning described the day as a festival of unity. Yet even as she projected this image of stability, the regent's inner circle knew the truth, that the capital was as vulnerable to political fracture as any battlefield in Navarre. Reports from the north spoke of Carlist advances in certain valleys, of royalist garrisons isolated and low on supplies. The arrival of foreign volunteers, British officers with clipped accents, French artillerymen with a practiced air of detachment, was welcome in terms of skill. But each new face risked feeding the Carlist narrative of foreign domination. Maria Cristina managed these arrivals carefully, distributing them among Spanish units and ensuring that foreign flags never flew openly in the field. Yet she could not fully control the stories told in the streets, where the presence of foreigners was sometimes exaggerated into wild claims of entire regiments of Englishmen and Frenchmen fighting under the regent's banner. Within the palace, her management of information remained meticulous. Servants were rotated frequently to prevent loyalty from hardening in dangerous directions. Correspondence was read twice before being sealed, even the routes she took to attend. Mass were altered without notice. Those who had served under Ferdinand recognized these patterns and could not help but note the difference in tone. Where the late king's vigilance had been driven by feverish suspicion, the regent's was deliberate, calculated, and grounded in a clear sense of her vulnerabilities. Still, the shadow of Ferdinand hung over her decisions. She knew that every misstep, a failed offensive, a diplomatic blunder, a sign of weakness, could be twisted into proof that the monarchy's legitimacy was as deformed as this. Whispers claimed the late king's body had been. Thus, she continued to anchor Isabella's image in the memory of her father, staging moments where the two were linked in the public mind. On one hot July afternoon, she attended a military parade, with Isabella by her side, the child wearing a miniature version of Ferdinand's old ceremonial sash. The gesture was deliberate, a reminder that the bloodline was intact, the throne unbroken, the past and present joined in the same royal figure. Yet such moments could only slow, not stop, the erosion of certainty. As the summer wore on, riots broke out in several provincial cities over shortages and taxes, and in Madrid itself, a protest by unemployed laborers nearly turned violent before the guard dispersed it. The regent knew that internal unrest could be as dangerous as the Carlist armies, perhaps more so. for it gnawed at the foundation. She stood on dock by the early autumn of 1835. The heat that had pressed down on Madrid all summer began to lift, replaced by cooler winds that seemed to carry with them both relief and foreboding. In the northern provinces, where the First Carlist War had been grinding on for 2 relentless years, the changing season signaled a shift in tempo. The Carlists, under commanders who had learned to use the terrain as both weapon and shield, were preparing a coordinated series of offensives timed to catch the royalist forces stretched thin and struggling to resupply after the summer campaigns. For Maria Cristina, this was the moment she had dreaded, the point when the Carlists, hardened by years of mountain warfare and emboldened by pockets of success, could strike not only at isolated garrisons, but also at the confidence of the capital itself. Reports from Navarre and the Basque country spoke of villages switching allegiance overnight, sometimes willingly, sometimes under the subtle coercion of Carlist priests who framed the war as a holy struggle for the rightful monarch. These same reports carried more insidious news, that Carlist propaganda had grown sharper, its allusions to Ferdinand's private life less veiled than before. In certain towns, crude ballads were being sung in taverns, verses that mocked the king who could not father Spain, pairing this insult with lines about a queen regent who borrows crowns from foreigners. The imagery was blunt, but it found fertile ground among populations weary of war and suspicious of Madrid's motives. In response, Maria Cristina pushed harder on her narrative. She ordered public masses of thanksgiving for royalist victories, even minor ones, to keep morale high, and she staged processions in which Isabella was presented as a child of promise, dressed in colors that echoed the Bourbon coat of arms. Yet the strain of maintaining this image was evident in the palace. Advisors whispered of budget shortfalls as the cost of the war mounted. Food prices in Madrid continued to rise, prompting unrest in poorer districts. And in the salons of the capital, political factions that had been uneasy allies began to eye each other with mistrust. The liberals wanted the regent to commit to constitutional reforms once the war was won. The conservatives feared that any such commitment would weaken the monarchy's traditional authority. Maria Cristina, caught between them, relied on the same survival instincts she had honed under Ferdinand's volatile reign, granting small concessions here, offering symbolic gestures there, always careful never to promise more than she could deliver. Still, the parallels with her late husband's rule were inescapable. Ferdinand had governed in a constant state of suspicion, convinced that enemies lurked behind every closed door. The regent's vigilance was calmer, more methodical, but the result was similar. A court in which trust was scarce, information was currency, and every move was weighed for its political risk. As the Carlist offensives began in earnest, royalist armies fought a series of grueling engagements in the mountain passes. Some ended in victory, others in retreat, but each drained the already thin resources of the government. Carlist forces grew bolder, targeting not just soldiers, but the lines of communication and supply that kept Madrid connected to the front. For the regent, the danger was not only military, it was psychological. Every lost convoy, every intercepted message could be turned into proof that the war was unwinnable, that the regency was faltering. In this climate, Ferdinand's legacy became an even more contested symbol. Royalist newspapers printed idealized portraits of him in full regalia, a steady father figure gazing over the child queen, while Carlist pamphlets depicted him as a spectral figure handing an empty cradle to foreign hands. The truth, a life marked by personal deformity, political repression, and paranoid control, remained locked away in archives, but its distorted echoes filled the streets. Maria Cristina knew she could not erase the whispers. She could only drown them in pageantry and persistence. And so she kept up the rhythm. Military updates framed as triumphs, public ceremonies linking Isabella to her father's image, quiet negotiations to keep the coalition in Madrid from fracturing. Yet the strain on her was visible to those who knew where to look. She spoke less in council, choosing her words with deliberate care, and her once confident public smile sometimes flickered into a look of calculation mid-gesture. The autumn air in Madrid was cooler now, but it carried the scent of uncertainty. And in the next part, as the Carlists press their advantage and unrest within the capital grows harder to contain, the regent will find herself forced to confront a choice she has tried to avoid since the war began: whether to risk everything on a decisive military gamble, or to tighten her hold on power in ways that will echo the most controlling instincts of the man whose reign she both inherited and survived. By the first weeks of November 1835, the First Carlist War had reached a point where the regent, Maria Cristina, could no longer delay the question that had been circling her council for months: whether to attempt a decisive military strike before winter locked the mountain passes again, or to draw back, consolidate resources, and accept that the war might drag on for years. Each option carried risks that could topple the fragile structure she had built since Ferdinand's death. A bold offensive, if successful, could shatter the Carlist strongholds and silence the whispers about Isabella's legitimacy by wrapping her reign in the glow of victory. But if it failed, the political damage would be catastrophic, feeding every rumor that the regency was doomed, and giving the Carlists proof that God favored their cause. On the other hand, a cautious withdrawal would preserve lives and resources, but might signal weakness, emboldening both the Carlist armies and the discontented factions in Madrid, who were already beginning to murmur that the regent's rule was little more than a holding pattern for inevitable collapse. As she listened to her generals argue, one urging a winter push, another warning of snow-choked supply lines, Maria Cristina's mind drifted to memories of Ferdinand's councils, rooms filled with tension as her late husband's suspicions often overshadowed the actual decisions at hand. He had lived in a state of constant control, issuing orders as much to protect himself from imagined plots as to govern his kingdom. She had prided herself on avoiding that level of paranoia, but as the war deepened, she found herself adopting some of his habits out of necessity, rotating guards more frequently, cross-checking reports from the front through multiple channels, even ordering the quiet surveillance of certain ministers whose loyalties were uncertain. These measures were not driven by Ferdinand's fevered distrust, but by cold political calculus, yet she could feel the uncomfortable resemblance growing. Outside the palace, the mood in Madrid was brittle. Bread prices remained high, and the influx of wounded soldiers from the front served as a visible reminder that the war's costs were being paid in blood as well as coin. In the poorer districts, Carlist agents moved like shadows, offering small sums for small acts: a sympathetic priest willing to preach against the regent, a shopkeeper who would allow pamphlets to be left on his counter, a coachman who could be persuaded to carry letters without asking questions. The pamphlets were increasingly blunt in their attacks on Ferdinand's memory, tying his barrenness directly to what they called the illegitimacy of Isabella's rule. One particularly vicious broadside depicted the late king as a gardener planting seeds in barren soil, watched by a foreign woman holding a watering can labeled France. The regent's counter-campaign relied on images that doubled as quiet propaganda. Isabella seated in her mother's lap beneath a canopy of blooming orange trees, or standing beside veterans of the Napoleonic Wars, their medals glinting in the sun as they pledged loyalty to her reign. These scenes were reproduced in engravings and distributed across the provinces, reminders that the Bourbon line was still rooted in Spanish soil, not foreign graft. Yet such imagery could only do so, much when weighed against the grinding reality of the conflict. In the north, Carlist forces under Zumalacà Reguehui scored several tactical victories, forcing royalist troops into defensive positions and cutting off smaller detachments from resupply. Reports from loyalist commanders painted a grim picture: dwindling ammunition, exhausted men, and the ever-present fear of ambush in the twisting mountain roads. Maria Christina's military advisors were split. Some argued for reinforcing the northern armies with whatever could be spared from central garrisons, others for pulling back to more defensible lines and waiting for spring. The regent's instinct leaned toward decisive action. She understood that the longer the war dragged on, the more the legitimacy question would fester. But she also knew that a failed offensive would hand the Carlists the narrative victory they craved. She was walking the narrow edge Ferdinand himself had so often stumbled upon, the line between projecting strength and overreaching. In private moments, she considered a third option: tightening her control over Madrid and the surrounding provinces so completely that even if the front faltered, the heart of the kingdom would remain secure. This would mean restrictions on movement, harsher penalties for dissent, and more aggressive censorship, measures that echoed the late king's authoritarian impulses, though she told herself they would be temporary. The decision weighed heavily, and she delayed it as long as possible, knowing that whichever path she chose would define the next chapter of her regency. Outside her chambers, the days shortened and the winds grew colder, and in the north, the Carlists moved with a confidence that suggested they sensed her hesitation dot by mid-November 1835. With the mountain passes not yet sealed by snow, but the winds already biting in the northern provinces, Maria Christina finally moved past hesitation and committed to a course of action that would define her regency. A high-stakes winter campaign designed to break the momentum of the Carlist insurgency before the year's end. It was a gamble shaped as much by political necessity as by military logic. Her generals had warned of the dangers: ice on the narrow roads, unpredictable weather, and the difficulty of resupplying troops in hostile terrain. Yet the regent knew that the war was not only fought with muskets and cannon, but with stories, and that if Madrid saw nothing but stalemate, the whispers about Isabella's legitimacy would grow louder, feeding the Carlist claim that God had. And in the Bourbon line, her decision was presented to the council, not as a choice, but as a decree. The royalist armies would press forward, reinforced by hand-picked units from central Spain and supported by a sudden infusion of foreign supplies, arms that had arrived quietly through coastal ports. To the public, she framed it as the final push before peace, a phrase repeated in broadsheets and Sunday sermons to give the impression of inevitability. Inside the palace, however, she tightened her grip on the capital in preparation for potential backlash should the offensive falter. Censorship was expanded. Permits for public gatherings became harder to obtain. Suspected Carlist sympathizers were quietly arrested and removed from the city. It was not yet Ferdinand's suffocating paranoia, but it was a step closer than she would have liked to admit. On the front lines, the campaign began with promise. In the valleys of Navarre, royalist columns advanced under crisp skies, retaking several small towns and raising the Queen's banner over their stone plazas. In some villages, bells rang in celebration. In others, the inhabitants kept their doors shut, waiting to see whether the Carlists would return. For a few weeks, dispatches to Madrid were filled with cautiously optimistic reports: supply lines holding, morale improving, Carlist units withdrawing into the hills. But the mountains had their own will, and as December approached, the weather turned. Snowstorms swept through the high passes, trapping supply wagons and forcing soldiers to march through drifts that swallowed their boots. The Carlists, more familiar with the terrain and better supplied from sympathetic communities, began to counterattack. Skirmishes broke out along the roads. Ambushes in narrow defiles left royalists dead, frozen where they fell. Worse still, the propaganda war followed every musket shot. Carlist leaflets left in recaptured villages mocked the regent's final push. depicting Ferdinand as a broken soldier trudging through snow with a bent sword, handing it to a shivering child. These images traveled as quickly as the news of the fighting itself, arriving in Madrid alongside the official proclamations of victory. Maria Cristina countered by ordering engravings of Isabella kneeling beside her father's tomb, a wreath of winter greenery in her small hands, the inscription reading, "For the king who returned Spain to her people." These were distributed widely, even to soldiers at the front, as a reminder that the campaign was part of a larger legacy. Yet even as she clung to the narrative, the cost of the gamble became clear. The winter advance had strained the treasury, consumed vital reserves, and bled away some of the capital's political patience. Bread prices rose again. Small protests broke out in the poorer quarters. Liberal allies grumbled that resources were being wasted on a war with no end in sight. Conservative monarchists, for their part, began to mutter that the regent's reliance on foreign arms was proof of her inability to defend Spain without outside help, a dangerous echo of the Carlist line. Within the palace, she doubled down on security. Routes to public events were altered at the last moment. Additional guards were stationed at key ministries, and even senior officials found their correspondence subject to scrutiny. Those who remembered Ferdinand's reign could not help but notice how closely her measures now mirrored his, though she applied them with precision rather than panic. The campaign dragged into the year's final week. Each mile gained in the snow was bought with hardship and doubt. Still, Maria Cristina held to her decision, convinced that retreat would be more damaging than any hardship endured. In the quiet hours after council meetings, she would sometimes walk the gallery where portraits of past monarchs stared down in oil and gilt, pausing before Ferdinand's image. There, she would study the carefully painted face that bore none of the secrets whispered in taverns, and she would wonder whether history would remember her as the queen who saved her daughter's crown, or as the regent who repeated the very patterns she had once survived. By the final weeks of December 1835, the winter campaign Maria Cristina had staked so much upon was entering its most fragile stage, a point where the boundaries between success and failure blurred in the ice. Snow-choked valleys of the north, the royalist forces had pushed further into Carlist-held territory than in any previous winter, seizing several key passes and fortifying them against counterattack. Yet each gain came at a cost. Men frostbitten beyond recovery, supply wagons abandoned in drifts, horses collapsing from exhaustion on icy roads. From Madrid's perspective, the proclamations of progress still sounded triumphant. Each recaptured village turned into a symbol of national unity in the official press. But beneath the celebratory language, the reality was that both armies were reaching the limits of their endurance. It was in this environment that whispers of diplomacy began to seep into the regent's council chambers. Certain moderate Carlist envoys, possibly acting without the approval of Don Carlos himself, had begun to hint through intermediaries that a pause in hostilities might be possible, at least long enough to see the armies through the worst of the winter. These overtures were cautious, almost tentative, a suggestion rather than a proposal, but they were enough to set off quiet debates in Madrid. Some of Maria Cristina's ministers saw in them a chance to claim a political victory, frame the truce as proof that the Carlists had been forced to the table by the regent's strength. Others warned that any pause would give the insurgents time to regroup, resupply, and flood the countryside with fresh propaganda. The regent herself, though tempted by the prospect of easing both the treasury's strain and the capital's growing unrest, hesitated. She knew the Carlists would use any lull to sharpen their narrative about Isabella's birth and the legacy of Ferdinand's reign. Already, their winter pamphlets had taken on a more cutting tone. One recent broadside, crudely printed but widely copied, showed Ferdinand as a frozen statue in the mountains, clutching a withered branch while a faceless child tried to light a fire at his feet. The implication was plain. The Bourbon line could neither warm nor grow without outside intervention. In reply, Maria Christina's supporters distributed images of the regent herself riding on horseback through the snow to visit troops. Scenes staged for the benefit of court artists, but designed to convey resilience and maternal guardianship over the nation. These visual duels were as much a part of the war as the skirmishes in the high passes. Meanwhile, conditions in Madrid were tightening. Bread prices, already high, rose again with the disruption of grain shipments from the north. Small protests were swiftly dispersed, but they left behind an uneasy undercurrent, especially in districts where Carlist sympathies were suspected. The regent responded with a mix of appeasement and control, announcing charitable distributions of food and fuel in the name of the young queen, while also quietly increasing the number of plainclothes informants in the markets and taverns. Those closest to her could see the toll this dual effort was taking. She moved with the same deliberate grace in public as always, but in private, her conversations were clipped, her gaze often fixed on the floor as she weighed each word. More and more, her methods resembled those Ferdinand had used to maintain power, the difference lying only in the absence of his erratic outbursts. The military situation remained precarious. While the royalists had taken key positions, the Carlists were proving stubborn in defense, launching sudden night raids that disrupted supply depots and unnerved garrisons. The bitter cold meant that even minor engagements could have outsized consequences, as wounded soldiers faced slow, freezing deaths before aid could reach them. And yet, despite the hardship, there was a sense among some commanders that the Carlists were feeling the strain too. Reports indicated shortages in certain Carlist-held towns, tensions between local militias and outside commanders, and even desertions among units that had been on continuous campaign for years. These cracks were part of what made the talk of diplomacy plausible. If the regent could seize that narrative and control it, she might emerge from the winter stronger than before. But she also knew that mishandling it could make her appear weak, a ruler forced to bargain because she could not win outright. And in the political culture she had inherited from Ferdinand's Spain, perception was often more decisive than reality. As the year drew to a close, Maria Christina held her decision close, neither rejecting nor embracing the diplomatic hints outright. Instead, she let her ministers debate, let her generals plan for both continued fighting and the possibility of a pause while she watched for the right moment to commit. In the stillness of the palace at night, she would walk the inner courtyards where winter frost coated the stone balustrades, thinking of the way Ferdinand had ruled, fiercely guarding what he saw as his right, even as his flaws undermined the throne beneath him. She was determined not to repeat his mistakes, but she could feel the parallels pressing closer with each passing week. And in the next part, as the first weeks of 1836 bring both a breakthrough on the battlefield and a dangerous turn in Madrid's streets, the regent will face the reality that controlling the war's military front may be easier than controlling the volatile heart of her capital dot by the opening weeks of 1836. The war that had defined Maria Christina's regency seemed to exist in two separate realities, one painted in the confident lines of official proclamations, where royalist banners advanced and the young queen's future looked secure, and another drawn in the quieter, grimmer strokes of lived experience, where soldiers trudged through frozen mud, civilians counted their dwindling loaves of bread, and every victory carried the shadow of its cost. On the northern front, the royalists had managed to hold the passes taken in the winter push, repelling several Carlist attempts to reclaim them. This gave Madrid cause for cautious celebration, and for a few weeks the regent's allies spoke of the campaign as proof that the tide had turned. The official press printed detailed accounts of gallant charges and stubborn defenses, often illustrated with engravings of officers saluting beneath the Bourbon flag. Yet even these victories brought no end to the fighting. Carlist units remained, Entrenched in the mountains, their supply routes still intact, their morale sustained by the certainty that time, weather, and weariness would work in their favor. In the capital, the political strain of sustaining the war effort began to show more plainly. Merchants complained of taxes that ate into their profits. Guilds grumbled about the lack of government contracts. And in the poorer quarters, the Carlist, underground grew bolder. Pamphlets appeared overnight on church doors and market walls, denouncing the regent as the foreign widow who governs in her interest, and mocking Ferdinand's reign with increasingly direct references. One particularly daring pamphlet, printed in surprisingly fine type for a clandestine press, showed the late king in profile, his hand extended toward a cradle from which a faceless infant reached for a crown. The caption beneath read, "The gift that could not be given." It was risky to distribute. Any possession of it could mean arrest, but it spread quickly, copied by hand when printers could not keep up. Maria Cristina responded by tightening her already firm control over the capital. New checkpoints appeared on major roads leading into Madrid, and the City Watch began conducting unannounced inspections of taverns and print shops. Permits for gatherings were restricted further, and several known Carlist sympathizers were exiled from the city without formal charges. These measures, while effective in the short term, carried the same echo of Ferdinand's more repressive policies that some of her advisers had quietly warned against. The regent, however, saw them as a necessary shield, not just against the Carlists, but against the erosion of confidence among her supporters. Meanwhile, she continued to cultivate Isabella's public image with care. Winter audiences at the palace were arranged so that dignitaries, foreign envoys, and even select citizens could see the young queen in person, always presented in a way that linked her to her father's memory. In one carefully staged reception, Isabella was dressed in a white gown trimmed with blue, the colors of the Bourbon house, and seated beneath a portrait of Ferdinand in full regalia. It was a calculated scene, the living heir framed by the image of the man whose crown she wore. Outside the palace walls, however, the city's mood was less controlled. Food shortages in certain districts led to sporadic unrest, and the presence of wounded soldiers returning from the front kept the human cost of the war fresh in the public mind. In some cases, these men became potent voices for the Carlist cause, whether intentionally or simply through their bitterness at the hardship they had endured. The regent's ministers urged her to increase charitable distributions to counteract the unrest, and she did so, but always in ways that tied the relief to the monarchy's image, with bags of flour stamped with the Queen's seal and public announcements crediting Isabella's generosity. Yet she understood that charity alone could not secure loyalty. Control of information remained essential. When rumors began circulating of secret peace talks with certain Carlist leaders, she had them publicly denounced as enemy fabrications, even as her envoys continued to probe the possibility in private. The balance was delicate. Too much openness risked giving the Carlists legitimacy. Too much denial could backfire if negotiations became public. Through it all, Ferdinand's shadow lingered, invoked by loyalists as a symbol of continuity, wielded by enemies as a reminder of weakness. In quieter moments, Maria Cristina admitted to herself that she was fighting not only for her daughter's crown, but against a narrative that had been seeded long before she took power, a story in which Ferdinand's failings were made to stand for the fragility of the entire dynasty. And in the next part, as the year unfolds toward its turning point, the regent will discover that the Carlists are preparing not just for continued war in the mountains, but for a strike aimed at the very heart of Madrid, where the political and personal legacies of Ferdinand VII will collide in ways she can no longer entirely control. By the middle of 1836, the war that had defined Maria Cristina's regency for nearly 3 years reached its most dangerous and delicate moment, not because of some massive battle in the north, but because the Carlists had finally found a way to bring their fight closer to the heart of Madrid. While the armies still clashed in the passes of Navarre and the wooded hills of the Basque Country, Carlist sympathizers within the capital began to coordinate with guerrilla units operating in the countryside. Their aim was not to seize Madrid outright, an impossible task without major military support, but to destabilize it from within, to turn the city into a place where fear and rumor eroded the regent's authority before a shot was even fired. The plan began with coordinated disruptions. Grain convoys bound for the city were ambushed just days from their destination. Smithies supplying arms to the royalists were set ablaze in the night, and in certain parishes, priests slipped coded messages into their sermons, urging the faithful to pray for the return of the rightful king. These actions were timed with a flood of printed propaganda that, for the first time, abandoned metaphor almost entirely. One pamphlet, printed on heavy, expensive paper, as if to suggest the backing of wealthy patrons, featured a crude but unmistakable image of Ferdinand himself, bent and gaunt, holding out an infant with a blurred face toward an empty throne. The caption beneath read, "The truth Spain dares not speak." Possessing such a piece was dangerous, yet copies spread quickly, folded into loaves of bread, sewn into the lining of coats, passed hand to hand in market alleys. Maria Christina's security network responded with speed and precision, raiding suspected print shops and arresting dozens of suspected agents. But the damage was done. The city buzzed with speculation, and the regent could feel the unease settling over the capital like summer dust. She countered with a campaign of her own, not of repression alone, but of visible presence. In late June, she appeared unexpectedly in several working-class districts of Madrid, riding in an open carriage with Isabella beside her, both dressed plainly, but wearing small Bourbon sashes. At each stop, she distributed bread and coins, received blessings from elderly women, and allowed children to approach the carriage. The visits were carefully planned, but staged to appear spontaneous, a way to show that the crown was not hidden behind palace walls. At the same time, she tightened controls behind the scenes. Additional guard posts along the city's perimeter, increased monitoring of correspondence, and even the temporary suspension of certain trade guild meetings until order was restored. Those who had lived under Ferdinand recognized the pattern. The regent was now walking the same narrow road of control he had once trod, though with steadier hands and a clearer sense of proportion. Still, the resemblance was there, and she knew it. On the northern front, the war continued to seesaw, with the royalists making gains in one valley, only to lose ground in another. A notable victory near the town of Villafranca del Bierzo in early August gave the regent a much-needed surge of good news. She seized on it, ordering Thanksgiving services in Madrid's churches and public illuminations that turned the capitals main squares into seas of flickering light. But the Carlists were quick to counter, claiming the royalist success was exaggerated and releasing their accounts of the battle that painted it as a Pyrrhic victory, won at such cost that it weakened the regent's forces more than it helped them. Back in Madrid, the game of narratives continued. Each public appearance by Isabella was matched by a rumor designed to undermine it. Each military victory announced in the press was met with whispered tales of secret defeats. And through it all, Ferdinand's shadow remained, not as a fading ghost, but as a living part of the struggle. To her supporters, he was the flawed but steadfast monarch whose daughter now held Spain's future. To her enemies, he was the origin of the dynasty's weakness, the proof that this regency was built on a hollow foundation. The regent had learned long ago that she could not erase the past. She could only decide how to frame it. In the final months of 1836, she began to speak more openly of Ferdinand in public, not to deny his flaws, but to claim them as part of the Bourbon resilience. "My husband," she told a gathering of military officers, faced trials in his life and reign that would have broken lesser men. We are here because he endured them, and we will endure now. It was a calculated reframing, an attempt to take control of the story before others told it for her. Whether it worked depended less on the truth of her words than on the willingness of Spain to believe them. By the year's end, the Carlists had failed to take Madrid, but they had succeeded in forcing the regent to spend more of her energy on the own capital stability than on the northern campaign. The war would continue, its outcome still uncertain, but Maria Cristina had kept the city, the crown, and her daughter's position intact for another year. In the quiet after the year's final council meeting, she walked the long gallery of royal portraits once more, pausing before Ferdinand's image as she had so many times. This time, she did not linger in judgment or doubt, but in a kind of resigned acceptance. His legacy, for better or worse, was now hers to carry, just as Isabella would one day carry hers. Outside, the lamps in the palace courtyard flickered. In the cold night air, the city beyond them still restless, still fragile, but still hers. And perhaps, as she thought of the years ahead, still enough.